And we have as our speaker now John Hilber. I've known John for a number of years, and he was a part of our little fledgling ancient Israelite religion sort of subgroup at ETS for a while. He wouldn't be here if I didn't like his work, obviously. But I've really been looking forward to this. His topic was stimulated by a discussion we had last November at the academic meetings when I brought up the conference and discovered you were working on some hermeneutical stuff that I found really attractive because it's eminently useful and needed. And that is, in a nutshell, I mean, he'll correct me if I do anything wrong here, but really sort of how it's problematic that we default to what we think of as a literalistic reading of Scripture. And when we do that, and we've all been trained to sort of do that, when we do that, we missed a lot of the texture, a lot of the, I'll just be blunt. We miss, in a lot of cases, what the writer intended to say. Okay, what the writer really wanted us to catch. And so he's going to tell you about his work and then, of course, deal with it and apply it in his session. So John, come on up here. John has his PhD from Cambridge. Yes, that Cambridge. Taught for a while at Dallas, and you're at Grand Rapids now still? Okay. Well, thanks for being with us today. Yep, absolutely. Yep.
Thank you. And thank you, Michael, for inviting me here. I like to think when I step into my classroom that each of my students is laying a $50 bill on my podium every class period. You all are laying a whole lot more down than a $50 bill, so I feel the weight in my backpack here of delivery. So I commend you all for the seriousness with which you take your interest in understanding what God has to say to us. So I commend you for that. You probably wondering what I've got an apple in my hand for. It's not just leftover from lunch. I'll get to this in just a moment. When I was in seminary, I was taught that you interpret the Bible literally unless the literal sense makes no sense. Interpret the Bible literally unless the literal sense makes no sense. And what I would like us to do this afternoon is to reconsider that assumption. And to do that, I want to bring in a communication model that is well known and has been well known for several decades among professional linguists. I'm not a professional linguist, but I'm using the benefit of what they have done. But among professional linguists, there's a model called relevance theory, and you'll be introduced to that, and Michael alluded to that a little bit earlier. Now, the fact that I was holding an apple in my hand is rather ostensive. It's in your face, if you will, and it perks your interest. You wonder what's going on. And that's part of the puzzle here of how we actually communicate with each other. One day, after chapel, I was walking with a colleague back to the academic building where the offices are. And in our particular institution, at that, when I was there at that time, lunch is right after chapel. And we are walking up to the academic building, and I had an apple in my hand. I hold it up, and I say, "I'm going to keep the doctor away." Now, you all know what I just said, right? What did I just say? Well, and I said, "I'm going to keep the doctor away." That's what I said. What did I mean? I'm going to eat an apple for lunch. Now, get out your dictionary and look up the words, "I'm going to keep the doctor away," and see if you can find in your dictionary and English grammars anything that has to do with what I was going to have for lunch that day. Now, the whole communication scenario depended upon an object in our physical environment. It depended on a shared assumption that he and I had about the time of day and what it means when you leave chapel. It also depended upon a common proverb in our English culture that I assumed that he knew, because most of us know that old proverb, that an apple a day keeps the doctor away. And I didn't supply the whole thing. I only supplied half of it. And by so doing, I prompted him in his mind to invoke the assumptions about proverbs and things, and he supplied the other half and he understood immediately what I had to say. He didn't have to even spend any time processing. He had enough evidence from the time of the day, physical environment, a half of a proverb. He had enough evidence to instantly figure out what I was actually communicating. Now, what I meant is not what I said. All right? Hang on to that. What I meant is not what I said. Now, there's more background to this that's important for our little communication exchange. The day before, in a faculty meeting, that was actually a division meeting. We were discussing the issue of how important or not backgrounds are in interpreting the Old and New Testament. And there was a little bit of a debate among our faculty colleagues as to how important background information is. And he and I were on sort of two sides of that. You're going to find out what side I'm on in this. And he immediately smiled. He's a friend of mine, in fact, an old mentor of mine. And he smiled and nodded, and he, immediately knew that I was at another level communicating to him further support for the argument that contextual interpretation is almost everything. And it was a sort of in-process illustration for him to get the point of that. And he smiled, and we went on our way to lunch. Oh, guess I'm behind the curve here. So literal sense or figurative is the name of this talk. So in communication, we can ask ourselves, is it a matter of decoding, where we take dictionaries and grammars and we apply the rules and we figure out what the person is saying? Do we decode language, or do we really, in a sort of mushy, not technically philosophical, formal way, but we really do it in a loose logic way? We infer what a person is communicating to us based upon the words that are said, based upon objects in the environment, based upon the time of day, and it is an endless list of the possible contextual assumptions that are part of our communication exchange. In fact, my wife and I, we just have permission for each other. One of us will start talking, and if we have permission, if you don't just say, just blurt out context. We'll just say that to each other. Because that's a signal that, wait, I got to catch up with you here. Give me some orientation. And my wife will say, Janice. And then I immediately know, okay, we're talking about our daughter. I immediately can, instantly understand now the sentence that came out of her mouth, because I understand the context out of which that's coming. That's inferential reasoning. The words that she said were not sufficient, literally, for me to know what she was saying. I knew what she was saying, but I didn't understand what she was communicating until I knew the context from which I could connect the dots and understand what she was on about. So do we decode or do we infer from context? And I would argue, and modern linguists would argue, that we infer from context in communication. Dictionaries or encyclopedic entries of the mind. Now, dictionaries are important. They give us some basic uses of words, but frankly, our brains are living encyclopedias built around words. If I say father, I can go to the dictionary and I can find some basic meanings having to do with biology, or perhaps if you're in a certain religious tradition, father means something. In fact, if I were standing in front of a group of Roman Catholics and said father, their instincts about that probably is different than this group here. And every one of us in this room has a different encyclopedic entry about the word father. For some of us, that's just a wonderful, joyful memory, maybe tearful if you've recently lost a father, perhaps a painful memory. So we have encyclopedic entries that go way beyond what the dictionaries have to offer us. And when we communicate with each other, we're not just dabbling into the dictionary entry, we're digging into the encyclopedic entries of our minds. And to the extent that we can share the same encyclopedic entries, and to the extent that those overlap, we're able to communicate well with each other. And when we don't communicate, it's often because we're missing something in the overlap. Not of the dictionary entries, but we're missing something in the overlap of the encyclopedic entries in our minds. So where this is going to go eventually is, and I think, Michael, I can't remember how you said it this morning, but to the extent that we can map in our brains the mindset of a late Bronze / Iron Age Israelite, or the mindset of a late Second Temple Jewish believer, to the extent that we can map in our minds the kind of cognitive environment, the assumptions that they have, to that extent, we will be better prepared and more able to just instinctively read the Bible the way that the original authors intended it to be understood. So that brings us to cognitive environment then. And relevance theorists, Sperber and Wilson were two of the founders of this theory back in the mid-1980s. And they define cognitive environment or contextual environment in this sense. It's not limited to information about the immediate physical environment, the apple in my hand. It would include that, but not limited to that. Nor the immediately preceding utterances. Rather, expectations about the future. What are our scientific hypotheses? And that's going to become very important when we talk about cosmology in the Bible. Whose scientific or whose assumptions about the natural world are we talking about when we read the biblical text? Religious beliefs, our memories, general cultural assumptions, beliefs about the mental state of the speaker. If you think I'm just, psychotic, what I have to say will be filtered by you differently. Maybe you're already doing that. Anyway, they all might play a role in interpretation. That's a very broad set of contextual assumptions. Now, there's another idea I'd like to introduce to you, although I'm not really going to introduce this because you all are aware of this instinctively, and all of this is instinctive to you because we live it every moment of the day that we're in communication. But this idea of accessibility. Let's say you're in an elevator and there's background music playing in the elevator. We call it elevator music for a reason. This is, sort of soft and indistinct and, it doesn't disrupt your thought flow. And then there are two people standing next to you in the elevator and they're having a conversation. Now, what your mind will normally tune into is the conversation of the two people who are next to you because that's more ostensive, it's more in your face, it's more out there or manifest, as they would say. And your mind doesn't really process the music coming out of the elevator speaker unless, what if the song that's being played was the song that you danced to with your spouse at your wedding? Now, all of a sudden, that piece of music that normally your mind would naturally filter it out, all of a sudden it hooks you because it is relevant. It has significance to you that for the people standing next to you, they're oblivious to it. It's just elevator music. Or maybe you're not really paying much attention to the conversation next to you until your name comes up in their conversation. They don't know who you are standing next to them, but again, all of a sudden you tune in a new sort of way. So our assumptions are ordered, our encyclopedic entries are ordered in our minds in terms of relevance. And as we move from context to context, that order is going to change. When you're at church, there's one set of assumptions that are sort of in a priority of order. When you're, at home talking with your kids, there's another set of assumptions that, with your friends, out at night, relaxing together, there's another set of assumptions at a sporting event or a concert. All these different contexts will reorder the possible assumptions that are in our brain, the things that are part of our cognitive environment. So by different degrees of accessibility of context, stimulus will make itself felt by the amount of effort that retrieval requires. The amount of effort that retrieval requires is based upon what order it is in your hierarchy of assumptions. Now, relevance doesn't just mean interest. I mean, we use the word a lot, relevance, and say, oh, that's not relevant to me, so I ignore it. And I'm not, and linguists don't use relevance in that restrictive of a sense, although that would include that. My students may not be interested in learning Hebrew, but I guarantee them that it will be relevant on the final exam. So I'm not talking about interest, and in fact, it may not even be relevant in the sense of it's going to make a big difference to me, but relevance has to do with what we as partners in communication might assume to be relevant. When I speak to you, what I say comes with it is a presumption of relevance. I'm not trying to waste your time. And so you assume that I assume, that you assume that I assume, and we have this shared language game that we play, that whatever is shared together either provides new information, it will reinforce something that you believe, or it might challenge something that you believe, but there's some cognitive benefit that is assumed in any exchange of information. Now, we're not always good at gauging those degrees of relevance. For my family, they have permission. I tend to go into detail too much. They just, they give me the timeout. It's not just timeout, also T for too much information, Dad. It means that I'm moving into material that they don't really need. And now if I think they need it, I'll push back and say, no, you really need this. But we work together and cooperate in our communication with the presumption of relevance. I have something important that I want to map over into your brain, and you assume that I have something to share that is of benefit to you. All right, let's talk about words and context now, because I don't want us to leave words behind. We often will say context is everything. Well, not quite. Context isn't everything. It's really, really important, or I wouldn't be up here wasting your time. But there's another piece of context that goes with it, and that's the words. And so what communicators do is they use words to guide their audience to that set of contextual assumptions that are going to be relevant to what they're trying to say. So they'll use words to sort of hook ideas in the listener's mind that guides them toward understanding what it is that they want to try to communicate. So words will guide to the relevant set of assumptions. My wife and I will say context. That means that the words were insufficient to set up the right context for us to understand the communication. We have to give a few more words that are sufficient or adequate to guide the listener. Janice, our daughter's name, that all of a sudden adds another word that is sufficient to set up the context then for proper understanding. And words are also efficient. Unless you're in conversation with me, generally words are not trivial. I tend to get into too much detail. TMI, Dad. So if you're a good communicator, you try to be efficient in your use of words. I assume all kinds of things about all of you out there, a lot of which I'm probably not even consciously aware that I'm assuming. I make assumptions about your faith, perhaps, or I make assumptions about a certain level of Bible knowledge as we get into conversation about some of the texts that we'll be looking at. There are all kinds of things that I just assume, and if I am too sparing of my words, I will not communicate well to you. I'll lose you somewhere along the line. And if I'm too verbose and it's right after lunch, you'll be napping on me. So good communicators will try to find that balance of what's called optimal relevance. That's the fancy catchword that is the principle that guides us in our interpretation, whether it's oral conversation or whether we're reading something that someone has written for us. There's this careful balance of sufficient wording, but yet not too much wording, certainly not trivia. And when a hearer follows the path of least effort, when they arrive at an interpretation that satisfies his or her expectations of relevance, in other words, it kind of clunk into place, to make sense, all the dots line up. In the absence of contrary evidence, this is the most plausible hypothesis about the speaker's meaning. That's just the way communication works. Now, as we hear someone go on in their discourse and we hear them say something that we can't fit in with what we thought we understood before, then we recalculate in our brains, based upon the bigger context of words, what's being said. But normally we seek to find the path of least resistance, the least effort. We are very efficiently created beings, not only in terms of our bodies and our biological processes are efficient, but our brains are also created to be efficient. We don't want to waste resources. That's true biologically, and it's true mentally as well. So let's make some application now, and maybe this has been all kind of abstract and ethereal, and hopefully with some illustrations that we'll start moving into, this will begin to make more sense. Literalism, as we're getting down to the topic at hand now. The relevance theorists and every modern professional linguist that I've talked with will say the same thing, whether they're working with relevance theory or they're working with schema theory or they're working with speech act theory. Whatever the modern theory of communication is, they'll say the same thing. There's no reason to think that the optimally relevant interpretive expression of a thought is always the most literal one. The speaker is presumed to aim at optimal relevance, not literal truth. Now, think about figurative language for a moment. One of the reasons we use figurative language is it's a very tight package of a lot of cognitive benefit. And so they've done experiments with people trying to decide whether people process in series or in parallel. Now, if you're at all familiar with computer technology, computers can process information one piece at a time, or it can process multiple pieces all at the same time. So if you've got when I started out with computers, it was an 8-bit processor. It could process 8 little discrete on and off switches or on and off signals at one time. And now, then it goes to 16 and then to 32, 64, 128. So there's this parallel processing is much more efficient in processing information that comes through than, say, just serial processing that takes one piece and then goes to the next piece and the next piece. Now, the old model of you interpret literally, and if that doesn't make any sense, then you punt to plan B and calculate that one. If that doesn't make sense, then you go to the next possibility. That's series. Parallel would be stimulus comes into your mind and your brain is so marvelously made that you simultaneously, at the speed of light, process all of the possibilities that are anywhere near accessible from your encyclopedic entry. You process it all instantly. And they've done experiments with people and found out that, yes, in fact, people will process information in parallel, not in series. And in fact, some studies have been done that show that if there are metaphorical meanings to be had, people will default to the metaphorical meaning. Why? Because it contains more cognitive benefit. We are efficient information consumers. So I'm not going to try to argue that figurative is the default, but if there is any default, it would be figurative, not literal. And some of the illustrations that I have to share with you in a few minutes will point out just how complicated that is. All right, let's talk about some illustrations on literalism. I have a temperature. Now, if I didn't, I would be, horizontal on this floor right here. And to say that I have a temperature literally, that's like saying I have mass or I have location. It's just utterly trivial. I mean, it's wasting your time to tell you I have a temperature. So when you say I have a temperature, we default to a slightly figurative usage of that. And it's become used so much and it's so idiomatic that one does find its way into the dictionary. That is that my body temperature is above normal. So here's a case where I have a temperature, you just instantly process, you don't even think the literal, your mind just immediately goes to to a metaphorical use. All right, the soup is boiling. This could be, again, literal or figurative. Depends on the context. If I'm following carefully a prescribed recipe for the soup and I have to let it boil 1 minute and then skim off the foam, it matters to me if my wife in the kitchen says, "John, the soup is boiling." She means it is now bubbling. It is hit 212 degrees Fahrenheit, and I need to attend to it. Now, if she has cooked some soup and put it on the table, and I sit down and I'm famished, and my spoon goes in, and she sends a warning to me, "The soup's boiling." Well, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily foaming, but it's an approximation. It's a loose use of the literal. And depending on the context that you're in, your mind immediately processes the literal or the loose use. I don't have to look down and see if there are bubbles coming out. We just don't do communication that way. He's a magician. We're gonna have a party for our kids on Saturday, and I was thinking of inviting Jack, and I said, yeah, Jack is a magician. It all makes sense in the context that he's somebody who does tricks. Now I'm talking to now let's change context. I'm talking to a buddy in the locker room, and he's complaining about, he's about the same age I am, and stuff starts happening, Some of you are old enough to know that. And so your knee's starting to, give you trouble. And I say, let me give you the name of my orthopedic surgeon. He's a magician. Literal or figurative, your mind processes it instantly. You don't go through some serial logical deduction formula to figure out which I'm referring to. All the lights go on in your brain, and you instantly shut down based on context, the one that makes best sense. He fights like a tiger. All right, you guys, we're going to work now from a figurative use towards a literal, because this works both ways. So let's we're ringside. All right. Now, what do we think about tigers? Just come on. Fierce, vicious, fast, deadly, brutal, strong. Cute. Yeah, Tony the Tiger. You're old enough. Tony the Tiger. You remember Tony the Tiger? I on my bicycle when I was a kid, I had I got enough box tops. I'm seeing a head shake here. I had this, rawr, rawr. Instead of a bell on your bicycle, I had a little Tony the Tiger head, and his jaw would open up and it would roar as I was going. I thought that was so cool. So tiger, yeah, they can be cute, but you wouldn't activate that one. Your brain would not activate cute in the context of ringside. What are some other ones? Sorry? Stealthy, sure. Speed, stealth. How about black and orange stripes? Well, yeah, and in fact, if the boxer happens to be wearing some colorful boxer shorts, that might sort of lighten up or illumine the simile a little bit. Not only does he fight like a tiger, he actually kind of looks like one in a sense. All right, change context. My daughter has a new kitten, takes it to the vet, and a big dog in the vet waiting room wanders over to the cage with its curiosity and puts its nose up against the cage, and instantly the dog jumps back. Everybody laughs. And let's say somebody says, he fights like a tiger. Now, what associations for tiger? Some of the ones that we said, but what else now? Claws, right. Now, normally for a prize fighter, you wouldn't think that except about Mike Tyson, bites off ears. So there are different. We have encyclopedic entries about tiger, and the items of that entry that are activated depends on context. Now let's change context again. We're working on a game farm in sub-Saharan Africa, and we've rehabilitated a tiger that was injured, and we nursed it back, and we were worried about whether it could reintegrate into the wild or not, and we've released it, and we're watching through the binoculars, and off in the distance, the tiger runs into its first encounter with another, territorial male, and I lean over and say, he fights like a tiger. Now, instantly now, you've mapped over all of the literal entries in your mind in that encyclopedic entry called tiger. It would exclude cute probably, but there are plenty of others. And so when you map over in almost a perfectly congruous way all of the associations and connotations of the word, now you've got a literal meaning. But that's not the default. That literal meaning comes to you the same way the differing degrees of metaphorical meaning come to you. That is, the context activates or is activated by the words, and the items that are chosen from that context depend on the whole package that you put together. Literal and then different degrees of figurative all depend on you connecting the dots. All right, let's move on from literalism now. Start moving towards some biblical passages. We've already mentioned today the notion of secondary versus primary communication situations. All of you are here because you buy into this. You buy into the idea that what matters is the primary communication situation, because that is the set of assumptions, that's the context in which the Bible is given and where we find its meaning. If you do business or mission work, you understand this, that you move from context to context. You are in a secondary communication. You are a secondary communicant who have moved into a new primary context, and you've got to work a little bit harder to figure that primary context out. That's why this is a little tougher in biblical interpretation, because of the cultural temporal gap. So we do have to work a little harder. We do have to process a little more mechanically our interpretation, because it's not instinct to us like the primary communication is. What we want to do is map the primary communication assumptions into our brains, and then we can live the primary communication situation as best we can. So this is all about primary versus secondary, and unfortunately we live in a secondary communication situation, unless you need penicillin or painkiller, and then you're thankful that you're in a secondary communication situation. That was a joke. And this leads to the second question, and we've talked about this, is accessibility of the ancient contextual assumptions. We don't have perfect access to all of the contextual assumptions that the primary audience had. We do the best we can by discovering archaeologically the material conditions that they had, finding texts, translating those. We do the best we can to begin. We do anthropological studies and make projections back to the past. So we do the best we can to reconstruct what the ancient assumptions were and make guesses as to what was their order of accessibility. Let's talk about a couple of them now. In the beginning, the heavens and the earth. Now, you hear a lot of conversation about, Enuma Elish, or the Marduk epic of creation that's often invoked. What is not well known, not many people know this, are actually two Mesopotamian creation texts that start out in the beginning. They're just not well known. They're fragmentary, unfortunately, but the text is clear enough that we know they begin with the same expression. In fact, in Akkadian, one of them is the exact identical Akkadian cognate to Hebrew, in the beginning. And they often will use heavens and earth. That's the standard starting point of Mesopotamian accounts that have to do with creation. Why do they do this? Well, one of the ways in which an author sets up the audience to properly understand what's going on is to use a topic sentence. When my wife or I say to each other context, we're really asking for a topic sentence. Now, because we are optimal in our communication, one word, Janus, or home group, or whatever, one word or two words might set up the context. But good communicators will use a topic sentence to set the audience up to the right set of contextual assumptions that are going to be useful and important to interpret what the person's going to say. And the notion of heaven and earth, and especially the separation of heaven and earth, are basic starting points in ancient Near Eastern accounts that have to do with creation. Formless and void, darkness, the deep. We move from Mesopotamia to Egypt, and now we find some language that parallels the conditions for the Egyptian creation account that existed when the Egyptian creator god, whichever tradition you want to take, begins to do the creative work. There's sort of this limitless cosmic ocean, or perhaps flood. There is darkness. There is water. And then there's a phrase in Egyptian that essentially means chaos. And so there are these conditions in Egyptian accounts that are quite prominent, and lo and behold, to varying degree, 3 or 4 of them map over, depending on, we can argue about some of them, but they map over with respect to Genesis 1, 2. And this shouldn't surprise us, if assuming Moses is the tradent, the one responsible for beginning this tradition. He's trained in the finest education that Egypt had to offer, and Israel's starting point in terms of their redemptive history is Egypt. I mean, this is an orientation point that is not far removed in remote accessibility. So we are set up from the beginning, no pun intended, with 2 verses that orient Israel's expectation to the kinds of things that were, quote unquote, relevant or significant or recurring in ancient creation accounts. I better check my time here. Oh, I gotta get moving. So they're interested. If you look at the other creation accounts in Mesopotamia or Egypt, they're interested in things that have to do with temples. They're interested in the relationship between the gods and the natural world. In fact, for most ancient Near Easterners outside of Israel, there was no natural world. That's again one of the, kind of the sort of brainstorm only by revelation kinds of things that are in the biblical text that Bill Arnold was talking about, that sets Israel's ideas in a completely distinct framework than Mesopotamia or Egypt, as they saw a transcendent deity. And for the ancient Near Easterners, it was all pantheism, essentially. So they're oriented. They want to know the relationship. What God is responsible for what? Who takes care of the crops? Who manages the light? Who manages the water? Who takes care of the animals? I mean, this is important stuff to them. That's pretty close at hand in their set of contextual assumptions and concerns. Cultic issues, agricultural issues, religious issues, relationships of the gods. Those are the things that their minds are set up for with these topic sentences. Now we get to 7 days. I will be the first one to argue that I think Genesis 1, 7 days are at the one level are 7 ordinary days. We got morning and evening. It's 24 hours, folks. Let's not try to play games with thousands of years in these days. But that's not the end of the conversation. Is the referent of evening and morning and day, is the referent having to do with cosmic chronology, or is it a literary use of the phrase? And I could take 3 minutes reading to you all of I would never get to all of them, and I don't know all of them, but many of the uses of the schema 7 in the ancient Near East. Baal builds his palace. 7 days. 7 days to dedicate the temple. One of the Egyptian creation accounts, the god Ptah, goes through 7 episodes or moments of creation. And in fact, there's a topic sentence that starts that Egyptian account out as well. I couldn't tell you the number of 7s and multiples of 7s in the words that are used in Genesis chapter 1. The hero Kirta in the Ugaritic legend has to go out and find a wife. Guess how long it takes him to find a wife? Well, of course, 7 days. What other length of time would you choose when you want to tell a good story? It's a literary schema that is ubiquitous in the ancient Near East. Now, let's ask ourselves about accessibility. For an ancient Israelite, what are their instincts going to look for first? Are they interested in natural history when there's not a shred of evidence anywhere else in the ancient Near East that anyone gave a rat's tail about natural history? Not one shred of evidence. They didn't care about natural history. That was not on their radar screen. That would have been way out there in outer space of their cognitive environment. But they were very concerned about a lot of other things. And I think that the instincts of Israelites would have been other than chronology of natural history. Now, the third thing we can get to is the issue of speed bumps, when there are clues in the text that a literal sense doesn't make sense. And that is one clue that you can use. That's pretty normal to know that you've got to move to a figurative meaning if all of a sudden you run into an inconsistency. But notice I didn't start there. I started with what were the normal instinctive reflexes of an ancient Near Easterner towards creation accounts. What are the things on their radar screen? What are they looking for in a positive sense? I don't have to start with the literal and then sort of nix it and then try to move on to other things. Ask yourself first, what is the natural instinct in order of accessibility of the ancient audience? Now, if that's reinforced with inconsistencies in the text when you read it literally, like the luminaries on day 4, for example, then that reinforces assumptions that you may already have about going other directions. All right, some examples of accommodation. I'll move through these quickly, a couple minutes left here. Accommodation is simply the adaptation of language in a way that allows the audience to understand. It's appropriate, and we accommodate to our children. You all understand instinctively what accommodation is. If you're a teacher, you do accommodation quite often because you're mindful of what the accessible contextual assumptions are for your audience. And if you start moving into areas that they cannot relate to because they don't have the background, you get yourself into trouble. All right, produce manager stocks tomatoes together with vegetables. Is a tomato a vegetable? No. I didn't know that until a few years ago. It shows you how pervasive certain cognitive assumptions are. So we can make a chart here about assumptions, true and false. Now, there are false assumptions that I held for a long time that tomatoes are vegetables, but a true assumption is that tomatoes are fruit. Now, it's also an assumption that tomatoes go in salads, and that leads to why they are put in the vegetable section, because the context, or I'll use the word genre, of the grocery store is culinary interest. And that organizes the way that I, as a produce manager, might place my products. Now, if you were walking into a botanical museum and you found tomatoes in the vegetable section, you would run to the curator and cry foul because you've changed genres. You're not in a grocery store anymore. You are now in a museum, and you have a different set of assumptions and expectations. Animal sacrifice. Bill Arnold pitched me a little softball this morning. And there's no collusion here. That was a joke, too. The priest shall burn all of it on the altar as a burnt offering, an offering by fire with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Now, there are assumptions that go with this. Offerings are food, but these are also acceptable to the Lord to make atonement. Now, there are some assumptions that also go with this that were common in the ancient Near East. Are they bribery? Am I baiting God with this offering to get to sort of coerce him into doing something? Does the Lord need food? These are assumptions that are potentially activated by the Levitical law. Now, if you've got an Orthodox understanding, you wouldn't go there. That thought never occurred to me until I started thinking, more broadly and critically about the Bible and other possibilities. But my natural assumptions were never that God needed food. I had a different set of assumptions. It never occurred to me as a possibility that he would need food. Now, people who are immersed in the ancient Near Eastern culture ran into that danger, and so there is in the Bible textual material that will guide anyone away from that false assumption if they were to make it. If I were hungry, I'd tell you. So God makes it explicit that the assumption about needing food is a false one, and bribery we could deal with that as well, but we'll move on. Realm of the dead, moving towards cosmology now. The deceased are disembodied entities. They live in the what realm? Yeah, they live in the unseen realm. Now, in the assumptions of the ancient Near Easterners, that the deceased people lived in the unseen realm, but there was a location, and it was underground. And there are ways I could, argue, I hope persuasively, that they really had that assumption when Gilgamesh goes on his journeys and he wants to talk to his dead buddy. He talks to him through a hole in the ground. When the Korahites rebel, the earth opens up and they are swallowed alive into Sheol. Now, that's a nice narrative passage. It's not poetry, folks. They had assumptions about where the resident place was of the disembodied in the unseen realms, unseen because it's under the earth. Now, only God has power to bring back the deceased, and so we work our way through 1 Samuel 28 and we make all the right adjustments, but this is a case of accommodation to certain assumptions about a tripartite universe that remains uncorrected. The sun rose. Well, it's a false assumption that the sun revolves around the earth. I would argue that the ancients thought that that was the case. I could make a case for that. It was, we say, well, it's just phenomenological language. It's phenomenological to us because we have a different assumption that the earth rotates on this axis. But for the ancients, that was not phenomenological language. Now, what's important for the truthfulness of Scripture is to ask what assumptions are being implicated in the truth statement that the text is trying to make. And nowhere can I find in the Bible that questions of cosmology, that is astronomy, I should say, are being implicated in these statements. God, the Holy Spirit, just seemed good to let them assume what they were going to assume about that because the interest of the text had to do with marking in the narrative time of day. Or perhaps in Song of Solomon, chapter 1, the Shulamite gets its suntan, which is an undesirable thing in that culture. Or in Jonah chapter 4, Jonah's waiting to see what happens, and the sun rises, and you go, uh-oh. Jonah's out in the sun, he's going to get roasted, and so, you get the hut and the tree and all of that. So there are true assumptions that, based upon narrative context, different aspects of the assumptions come into play. They're implicated in the narrative, but nowhere are we implicating any of the false assumptions. They're just left ignored. So accommodation can work when certain contextual assumptions aren't necessary to the communicative, the informative intent of the passage, and they're just left on the side as incidentals. And what matters is what assumptions are being implicated or pulled into the textual context itself to tell the truth story that the author wants us to believe. And relevance theory gives us the kind of apparatus, the kind of language to talk a little more precisely about what our doctrine of accommodation means. Summary. Oops. That'll go away, won't it? Communication is inferential. We do not default to the literal. It's inferential based on our cognitive environment. Words that we use are important because the words set the context that the listener is supposed to use to infer, to connect the dots of meaning. And they activate assumptions that are accessed in order of relevance. If there's something remote in the order of relevance, then the words need to, in some way, pull that assumption closer at hand. And if the words are really accessible and close, then you can use fewer words. When contextual relevance is met, we stop processing. And I would argue for Genesis 1, contextual relevance is fairly quickly met with comparative religious statements with regard to Israelite religion versus ancient Near Eastern religion. They didn't, like I said, they didn't care a rat's tail about natural history. That's not part of their assumptions. I think they would have stopped processing when they made the theological connections there. And assumptions that are weakly related to the informative intent of the passage are the responsibility of the audience. If you want to assume that the sun revolves around the earth, that's your responsibility. Don't blame it on the Holy Spirit. Because that assumption is not being implicated in the truth statement that is being made in the text of Scripture. So that's our responsibility, our error, not the divine authors. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Well, you can go out and take a little break if you need to. We have William Osborne, next. John, I have to ask you. You're off the hook. Yeah. I mean, what's the elevator pitch to somebody who's just really kind of stuck on defaulting to literalism all the time? I mean, you either pull something out of your presentation here, but you got 30 seconds with somebody, and that they just need a good piece of advice.
That's not the way normal communication works in the way we talk to each other every day. And the Bible is unique in being God's word, but it's not unique in terms of it being some kind of different form of discourse. There's not some Holy Spirit language or something that that's there. And so I would just say, read the Bible the way you would talk with me, and you don't presume literalness when you talk with me. You just instinctively go with the way I use my language.
Yeah, that's good, because I like the way you put it about activating. The context activates a literal thing in our head the same way it activates the metaphorical stuff in our head. So I like the way you put that. Thanks. Is Rusty in the room?